We just advise sort of keeping this in mind as we're making decisions about any levies that are before you or new ideas, because we are sort of, no matter how we cut it, it looks like we are at risk of bumping up against that cap unless we see a significant, consistent jump in other factors.
Some sobering news from the Seattle City Council's Finance Committee this week, as the city appears to be reaching a limit on levies that could have some widespread impact on city finances. This amid Mayor Katie Wilson's call for some budget cuts just around the corner here, and a move by the council to erase a controversial decision about affordable housing. These stories and so much more this week. Plenty to talk about on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I am a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I am with my friend and co-host, David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. David, I am connecting with you from Peoria, Arizona this week. We've been talking so much about the Mariners. I had to come down, see spring training myself. I'm on a fact-finding mission, and the facts I've figured out so far are as follows. This team is really fun to watch, and it's awesome to see a game in early March in shorts and a T-shirt on.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that informs your opinion of the team.
Yeah, I know. I'm very jealous. Last time I went down there once, and it was, I think it probably around March too, and it was cold and wet up here, and we went down there, and it was like, upper 80s, and I'm a little jealous of you.
It's the best. We're going to make that trip together one of these days, man, I promise. But thank you, David. Thanks also to all of our patrons. Make sure you give if you can. Giving levels start out at just $5 per month. That's Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Thanks for watching this podcast on Converge Media, too. The video version of the show is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. And a special shout out to a new show sponsor, Phillips Law Firm. Phillips attorneys know this community because they live here, too. After a car accident, they fight for their neighbors and the people who call Washington home. Call 1-800-JUSTICE or visit justiceforyou.com. Phillips Law Firm, unleashing justice for you. All right, let's get going. Time for Right Here, Right Now. David, we talked about this issue of levy capacity back in January when you wrote about this for the Seattle Times. But to quote Martin Lawrence from Bad Boys 2 in 2003, this just got real because now the Seattle City Council's Finance Committee is talking about it this week. Quick review, folks. State law limits Seattle's ability to add new property taxes, even those approved by voters. So in Seattle, as you know, we've had a decade of bigger and bigger ballot measures over the past few years. So the city is basically up against that state limit and has, as we're seeing this week, just $780 million of room over the next 7 years. And that's before the library levy is voted on this fall. David, what are you seeing behind the numbers here?
Yeah, I mean, there's two pieces to this. The first, as you mentioned, is the fact that the levies have continued to grow year over year. It has been kind of, the last three mayors really have wanted some larger and bigger and more dramatic levy, sometimes multiple, to hang their legacy on. It's Harold during the campaign talked a lot about the transportation levy and the housing levy and then the education levy, all of which grew substantially. So that's one piece. The other piece is that unlike pre-pandemic times, property values have just not grown as quickly. And so, when property values grow, then the total tax rate kind of decreases, and that gives you a little more space. But because property taxes haven't grown as much, or property values haven't grown as much, then that margin is a little more narrow. The implications here are pretty significant because, as you mentioned, they have to think about renewing the library levy, which they probably will do. And then, for the last decade, if a mayor had a priority that they wanted to fund, this was the way to do it. Because in our tax system, in some ways, it's kind of the easiest thing to do is to go to voters and ask for more property taxes because it's legal. Voters generally say yes. It brings in a lot more money. And so, if you're Katie Wilson and you're coming into office, maybe once upon a time you thought, hey, I want to do big, universal pre-K or whatever it might be.
Right.
The easiest way to fund that would be to do a levy. Or I want to fix up Seattle Center, for example, for $1 billion. That's the easiest way to do that would be a levy. You can go down the list here, but the reality is she could maybe add one more levy if she wanted on top of a library renewal, and it couldn't be that big, and then that would be it. There are other options, but the fact of being at this cap really sort of shifts, I think, the political calculus around certain priorities in City Hall in a way that hasn't really been a factor over the last decade.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about some of the budget cuts that the mayor might be asking for next year in just a little bit. But I did want to focus on this library levy in particular because it's now at this $219 million level over 7 years. That's what we in Seattle have been paying over the past 7 years. It's due up for a renewal this fall to perhaps stay at its current level or go above that. I'm just trying to figure out what pressures are on that levy in particular, because I know there's been talk of increasing that levy amount. Will that argument hold up? It's just, for me, a very interesting place for this levy to be, in that it's never really faced any formalized opposition in Seattle since voters first approved it in 2012.
No, the thing about this levy too is it has never really delivered on its promises, and mostly that's because of the pandemic. But the point of it was that they were going to have longer hours, and basically, I mean, it's the longer hours piece that has not really come to fruition for a few reasons, staffing and all that.
Yeah.
Then the question is, does more money kind of help it achieve the things you said it would help last time? And do voters care about that? It used to be with these levies that really the only consideration was political. Can voters stomach paying a little bit more for priorities? And the answer to that has been universally yes.
Yeah.
This is the first year, and it's why I wrote about it back in January. I thought it was significant. This is the first year that political consideration is not the only one. Now you've got this kind of math equation of you have to prioritize because the city just doesn't have the same level of space. So whereas before the question was, will voters approve a larger library levy? I would basically bet my mortgage on the answer being yes.
Yeah.
But now the question is that the most important thing to Katie Wilson? Does adding more library hours, is that more important than, summer preschool or whatever it might be? Is it more important than Seattle Center? By the way, Pike Place Market is going to probably come and ask for more money. Is it more important than that? Is it more important that, at one point there was consideration for a public safety levy?
Yes.
There's just a lot of possible directions you could use up that cap space. Frankly, Katie Wilson is the first mayor who has to think about that.
Yeah. And let's get into that, because you actually were writing about this recently for the Times. Mayor Wilson sent out a memo to a number of city departments, all of them actually, looking for options for a potential 5 to 10% budget cuts. Let's talk about this, why she did that, for one, and then any idea where those cuts, I guess, would come from. Is it citywide cuts, department by department? What's going on with this behind the scenes, this idea of the mayor asking for some cuts from city departments?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's sort of another data point in the Wilson administration so far, kind of going a little status quo with what past mayors have done. Harrell, in pretty much every year of his administration, ran this same exercise because
he did this too.
Facing budget deficits. They want to go into the budget with as much information as possible. So what they do is they go to all the departments and say, what would a 5% cut look like? What would a 10% cut look like? And they have that in front of them, and they can say, we can stomach this, we can't stomach this, here's where we can get money, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
That's not a new exercise. I think the reason it stands out, I think it's noteworthy every year just because it is telling of where the city's budget is at.
Right.
I think it's particularly noteworthy in the context of Katie Wilson because her reputation is anti-quote austerity budget, going to do more progressive revenue taxation. And here she is, though, doing an exercise that past mayors have done, preparing for possible cuts. I will say that despite the reputation that maybe she gained on the campaign trail about being, entirely about progressive taxation, she has also been pretty open about the fact that there would probably need to be some cuts. It was actually in her acceptance speech when she was formally elected mayor. She said that. She said, we're going to have to take a close look at programming and do some trimming here and there. So if you're paying, basically any attention at all to what she's saying, this isn't particular surprise. But I think for the public, who a lot of whom maybe see her as, a socialist mayor who's going to tax spend, there are some indications that she is at least preparing for the possibility that taxing isn't going to solve all of the city's problems.
Yeah, there's definitely some pragmatism there, and I guess some realism in terms of what's happening with this budget. I wanted to jump back on that progressive revenue piece, certainly something that has been an interest of Katie Wilson's for a long time, long before she was mayor. How does that factor into this conversation? Because I know there's been some talk about a citywide capital gains tax. Would those dollars be able to be collected in such a way that they would help out with this budget? I'm thinking no on that, but I'm just trying to look ahead with this idea for progressive revenue and how that could impact this situation.
No, almost certainly not. It would not help this year.
Right. I mean, like the state's looking at this millionaire's tax wouldn't be collected for another couple of years. Feels similar to that in a way.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know, and genuinely, I don't know if the fact that the state already collects a capital gains tax, if that would make it easier for the city to scale up. I genuinely don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
But, if you look at past precedent, when they passed the Jumpstart payroll tax or the social housing tax, which are, of course, different forms of taxation, but both of those took at least a year, I think, maybe more to get up and running. So no, it
Generate
wouldn't
some revenue, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah. So no, it wouldn't solve this year's problem.
Okay. And I guess where does it fit in the long term with it, though? I mean, it feels like it's going to be part of the answer. I just haven't seen that unveiled from the Wilson administration yet, or any real concrete examples of that on the city council as it stands yet this year.
Yeah, I mean, she has kind of teased an announcement around that. I think to the extent that there would be some new progressive taxation, it would probably be that capital gains tax.
Yeah.
Because I just don't know what the other options are. You could scale up, you could turn up the dial on the payroll tax, the Jumpstart tax, but I think even Mayor Wilson is a little concerned about what is happening in the employment sector. And so I don't know if she would be wanting to do that.
Yeah.
And question around how much money a capital gains tax could bring in. Outside of that, I just don't know what options there are. You could do, thanks in part to Katie Wilson, the advocate, the city could technically do a flat income tax, but that kind of defeats the purpose of having an income tax at all, which is that it's supposed to be progressive. The city is legally allowed to tax everyone's income equally, but I don't think they're going to want to do that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that does kind of leave her with cuts. And, if she does bring in new money, my guess would be she's going to want to target that at shelter, I would think.
Right.
Because she has made some big promises around shelter, and it's going to need more money if you want to scale up that level of shelter.
Yeah.
And so in order to do that, if you take that money and dedicate it to something specific, you're going to have to find money elsewhere to fix this budget hole. It would be funny if, sort of ironic in some ways, if the mayor who's supposed to be the most progressive in a generation is the one to finally fix the city's budget. Wow. Structural budget issues, because that's the problem. Is for the last 5 years in particular, the city has taken this Band-Aid approach where they close the deficit each year with no eye toward the next year. And then they come back around and there's another big deficit. There is a path to making it so you don't have to do that exercise every year. And it probably includes either a significant new tax source or, I don't know about significant, but, meaningful cuts to city programming. It would be interesting if Katie Wilson, the socialist progressive mayor, is the one to finally take that issue head on. Because certainly, say what you want about how Harold did things, he did not take that issue on. He did everything he could to avoid fixing the structural problems behind the debt, or behind the budget. So, we'll see how she approaches it.
Fair enough. All right, well, up next, a decision about housing in the SoDo area that drew major controversy last year has now drawn a reversal of direction from the Seattle City Council. More ahead on Now Hear This. Well, a plan for a Makers District, affordable housing and retail units in the SoDo area near the stadiums, appears to be on its way to an early demise. The council approved an ordinance last year to establish this Makers District, but this week, the Land Use Committee is reviewing an ordinance that would repeal it. As you may recall, this proposal, championed by former Seattle City Council President Sarah Nelson, was hotly contested by the Port of Seattle, including Port Commissioner Fred Feldman.
I'm here today to support the experts from the maritime industry who are best qualified to identify how this proposal puts our local economy and high-wage jobs at risk. Flipping industrial lands into residential properties create incompatible uses, resulting in more congestion and delay that makes our port less competitive.
All right, quick backstory here. Last year's vote by the city led to a review filed with the Growth Management Hearing Board. The city was found to have failed to follow proper procedures in establishing this ordinance that set up the Makers District, and thus the city was ordered to repeal this ordinance by May 11th of this year. David, looking at this, the vote from last year, it was a 6-3 decision with yeses from Nelson, Moore, and Solomon, all no longer on the council at this point. There were also yeses from Saka, Rivera, and Hollingsworth. The noes were Kettle, Strauss, and Rink. Do you see Saka, Rivera, or Hollingsworth pushing to keep this Makers District in place? Because this really felt like Sarah Nelson's bill to me, and she's no longer in office.
No, and I think this repeal is an acknowledgement of that. It's sort of I would say it's not so much a statement of exactly what Councilmember Lynn thinks about this particular piece of property, so much as it is a statement about the juice not being worth the squeeze here, basically, which is that a big fight that the port launched. It's a fight that the city, if they wanted this to succeed, would have to go pretty far through court, would have to appeal the growth management hearing. There is also this other court hearing around this that the city is currently technically litigating. Honestly, the arguments seem to so far be favoring the port. Their argument is basically that this was done specifically at the behest of Chris Hansen and therefore represents an illegal spot zone.
Right, the process of it too. I know the port had a lot of challenges with the way that.
There's a lot of process challenges, but I think for me the kind of which are kind of hard to wrap your head around. But I think the most important question was this done specifically to benefit one property owner?
Okay.
The reason there's so much process around zoning is you don't want to get into the habit of basically the public entity in Seattle City Hall doing the bidding of individuals to benefit them financially. That has a whole kind of can of worms. And the city was arguing, no, this was not done for Chris Hansen because there isn't actually a project being built yet. It was just sort of theoretical. But the only person that it really benefits is Chris Hansen. And there's evidence that he was meeting with council people and lobbying council people. So the arguments seem to be kind of tilting in the port's favor, combined with the fact that I think the council just, they want to take a more comprehensive approach to housing in Seattle. And they just don't think a long protracted fight over this one property is really worth it. If you're former council president Nelson, this was a significant priority for her and a not insignificant part of her legacy as a council person. And now it is being wiped off the map.
I did want to ask though, do you think this issue is finally dead? Because different city leaders have tried many times over the past 2 decades to put more housing in SoDo. Is it a point where I guess I'm just trying to figure out, when does Seattle's affordable housing issue get to the point where city leaders are going to want to jump on this electric third rail again to try to put housing around the stadiums? Is this issue dead, do you think, at this point?
I would say for a while, yeah. I mean, for a few reasons, because one, it's, just building housing in SoDo near the stadiums isn't going to fix the housing crisis. The city does have to take a bigger view of things. And I think they're going to. I think in the next round of comprehensive plan updates, there's indications that Mayor Wilson wants to go bigger with density near transit and so on and so forth.
Right.
And so, compared to that push, the 900 or so units that would be built in this one place are just not particularly significant. I do think AI might have a little bit of a role here, which is when you look at the city's employment market, it's very soft, particularly in the tech world. And there is a lot of concern that AI is going to really eat into the tech employment sector, which would then maybe put a lot more care into how the city's posture towards the kind of more blue collar physical work of port. If we're feeling a little nervous about what happens with tech, maybe we should be a little more cautious around the things that we do around, the shipping and maritime industry in South Seattle. So I think, all of those things, I think that a lot of the council people are probably not actually opposed to building housing in this area.
Sure.
I think a lot of the port's claims around what it'll mean are frankly overblown. You can build a hotel there, and for some reason, for them, a hotel is fine, but housing is existential. It just feels a little thin, frankly. But it is a fight that they were going to pick, and a fight that they seem like we're on their way to winning. And the council is just saying, you know what, we don't want to see this thing all the way through to the end.
Yeah. Well, heads up, folks. There is a public hearing on this issue, April 1st at 9:30 at City Council chambers in City Hall. Check it out. We'll follow up on this when that happens. I wanted to jump back to some decisions in front of the full council this week, David. They're voting on that resolution asking Seattle police officers to document and report violations of, quote, law enforcement professionalism standards. If and when federal immigration agents come into Seattle, they're looking at that. The council's been supportive of that. But there's also an interesting resolution on the docket, I thought. The council looking at an opportunity to develop a regional transportation hub adjacent to Westlake Park. So we're going to touch on transportation in the World Cup in a second here, but I wanted to look specifically at this Westlake plan because it appears to be centered around the new Sound Transit station going in there and some improvements to the old monorail line. Just some big thoughts here. How do you see this coming together, this idea of having a regional transportation hub right there in Westlake Park?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big lift, and it's been kind of swirling out in the ether for a while. It's also why, frankly, Seattle Center is asking for money right now. They're saying, we're doing these big investments up in Westlake. Like, let's connect this all and have this one big kind of happy corridor. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be disruptive and significant. But again, if you ride the light rail, it's pretty clear that Westlake is the busiest station. So if you're going to build a hub, it makes some amount of sense for it to be at Westlake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know those improvements that are coming around the monorail and all that, they're going to be happening over the next several months here. A lot of it going on after the World Cup, just aside there. But I was very interested to see all the partners that are at work on this resolution. You've got a Westlake Civic Committee that includes the Seattle Crack and the Muckleshoot Tribe, Amazon, Downtown Seattle Association, Boys and Girls Club, just to name a few. There's a lot of economic and civic firepower involved here. And I guess I'm just trying to look at this big picture again. When we're talking about this light rail station, almost exactly in between Pike Place Market and the Convention Center, it just seems like a lot of people want to make sure this is done right. How important is it for this light rail station, as it's been established, to be successful, David, in your mind?
Yeah, very. I mean, we're talking about a lot of concerns around downtown, and particularly in Westlake. It's aside from the kind of, public safety concerns, it's just there's a lot of buildings there that were built for another era, a lot of brick and mortar, large retail buildings. And
yeah,
I think there's a lot of interest in not allowing Westlake and that particular area to devolve into a bit of a ghost town with empty storefronts and things like that. And I think putting a major regional transit center there, the hope is there's some vibrancy that emanates out from that. And I think that's probably not incorrect. Again, and I think Pike Place is probably the defining, beyond this, other than the Space Needle, I think Pike Place is probably the defining feature of Seattle. And it's, I think, where a lot of tourists go right away. For better or worse, a lot of tourists are coming off of buses onto 3rd Avenue right now, which is not, I think, exactly the welcome that a lot of people want. So building a kind of big, fancy, new light rail station there, I think, is really key to the city's vision for what downtown is and will be.
Yeah, absolutely true. We're going to see what happens there. Interested to figure out what comes next. All right, coming up, I did want to kick around some more World Cup issues with you, David, especially when it comes to transportation. Looking at that topic just ahead on What's Next. David, one last Seattle City Council issue to touch on this week. The Transportation Committee on Friday looking at expanded transit access for the World Cup. Two big issues on my mind here. It's quite possible the Iran-Egypt match set for June 26th in Seattle, that might not happen. The U.S., of course, currently at war with Iran. The country's soccer federation reporting that this week. It might be very possible that Iran does not play in Seattle or the U.S. They have a few matches in L.A. too. And more locally, I'm thinking about the work that's squeezing down I-5 into 2 lanes for this construction project on the Ship Canal Bridge. That's going to be on hold during the World Cup, so hopefully some relief there. I just wanted to look at this broadly with you again, David. What do you think it's going to take to make World Cup 2026 go smoothly from a transportation perspective in Seattle? Because FIFA, these numbers always get me. 750,000 visitors potentially coming through here. That's about the entire population of Seattle. How's that going to work? That's my question I always come back to here.
Yeah, I feel like I'm really in the dark on this one because I've never, of course, experienced something like the World Cup before. I just don't see how you could possibly have 750,000 people come through Seattle. Despite some estimates, I would say there's probably like 400,000 people, maybe 300,000 or 400,000 people downtown for the Seahawks victory parade.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
We're thinking that's going to be the kind of norm in Seattle. I mean, I guess it's spread out over the course of a month, so it's not all at once. Maybe it's also, again, I don't exactly know where they're getting their numbers.
Yeah.
I just remember being down at the stadiums when the Mariners were in the playoffs and there was a Seahawks game right before.
Yes, right.
And that was packed. That's 2 full stadiums. And the city was fine. I mean, it was crowded and it was like a little uncomfortable, but the city adapted. It was fine. So I guess in my mind, I'm like trying to understand how a single game in Lumen Field, which is like pretty common, the Seahawks always sell out. And, we had Taylor Swift and the Mariners playing at the same time. And
sure.
It just doesn't feel to me like something the city hasn't seen or handled before. But again, I'm not like, I've never been at a World Cup before, so I guess maybe I don't understand the magnitude of this thing.
I suppose too. Yeah, and I think this event has been growing in popularity over the past several years. I remember going in 1990 in the Los Angeles area. I was still living there at the time, and you definitely had to be careful getting around. All these games are in the Rose Bowl, which is kind of in its own little box canyon there, and its own transportation issue to get in and out of. But I'm interested to see how the city disperses people, I guess. And I did want to ask on that. I'm wondering how light rail opening up from the east side might affect this, because that service is supposed to go online at the end of March. Maybe that is going to help this situation. Maybe people are able to move from the east side a little more easily. Do you think that's going to have an impact?
Yeah, I think that'll help because people could stay in hotels a little more easily on the east side and then get into town. And then it's really going to help if you're coming from the north, because the train, kind of travels that Linwood route and then across the water. And so if you're if you're north of the Chinatown International District, you're seeing trains every like 3 minutes at this point, because there's so many of them coming. So that is really going to help too. If you're, from the folks who might, park at the park and ride or whatever in Linwood and come down, it's going to be pretty easy to get in. The real challenge is going to be, Stadium Station. It's just like feels a little underbuilt for these big events to me, and how they handle that. But, again, I've seen big crowded events down there, and while perhaps there are some waits, it tends to work out okay.
It can be done. It can be done. All right. Well, David, I do need to wrap up with you, and I did have a spring training conundrum I could use your help with. So I'm in Peoria. The Mariners, of course, share their stadium here with the San Diego Padres. I went to a Mariners game one day, and then Padres the day after when the M's had an off day. Works out pretty cool. But here's my question. Am I required to be a Padres fan because they share the same facility? Because I got to say, I was kind of pulling for their opponents, the A's, because I like an underdog. It felt a little weird. So here's the question. If your team shares a facility, should you be a fan of that team that shares it? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know. Isn't that why they have the Vetter Cup? Isn't that there's some connection there?
Right. When the Padres and Mariners play each other. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I've always kind of liked the Padres, so I would root for the Padres just because, it's like San Diego, Seattle, they feel like similar sized cities.
Okay.
Seems like a good fan base.
Yeah.
So I would root for the Padres. But
okay. All right. I appreciate the advice, because you do get some weird looks around here. And I got to say, I have seen shirts of all different colors here. I threw on a Phillies jersey just to confuse people here as well. So always good. David, I always appreciate talking with you about everything, man. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, David. Thanks to everybody who is listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Become a patron, why don't you? Please check out Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Pledge at $5 a month or more. Thank you for the support there. Great to have you listening to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you are tuning in. To our 9 listeners in Mexico, bienvenidos. Thanks for coming on board. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. We will see you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2026.